Welcome to Midnight Pasta. Tonight's story is titled, I Tried to Clone My Family, but They Came Back Wrong. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. It means a lot. I'd never really been one for family vacations. Sure, my wife, Sarah, and our two kids, Ben and Lily, used to talk about trips. Big ones, small ones, exotic ones. They'd sit at the dinner table and toss around ideas, picking out places I'd never been, and I'd listen, nodding, just happy to see them excited. It was always a little awkward, me being the one who stayed behind, buried in my work. You see, I wasn't like other dads. I wasn't like the man who would go on fishing trips or watch football on the weekends with his sons. I was a scientist, a biotechnologist. My focus, for years, had been on genetics, cloning mostly. The field was still young, but I'd made quite a name for myself in the early days. My research was groundbreaking, even if most of it had been theoretical. The idea of replicating life, of creating exact copies of something or someone, had always intrigued me, but it wasn't until that fateful flight that things really began to spiral. It was a Friday night when Sarah's excitement finally convinced me to pack up and join them for a long weekend. We were flying out to a quiet island somewhere off the coast. It wasn't a place I'd have chosen, but it was an island. A place to unwind, a break from the lab. But I didn't know, then, that I was about to embark on the flight that would change everything. I remember it like a dull ache now, the day we boarded. Nothing was unusual at first. Ben was restless, fidgeting in his seat, and Lily was staring out the window, humming to herself. Sarah, always the calming presence, had her hand on my shoulder, her smile as warm as ever. I'd never been good at small talk, so I kept my gaze on the book in my lap, trying to ignore the familiar hum of the plane as it ascended. It wasn't until we reached cruising altitude that things started to feel off. At first, it was just a flicker of something, an odd sensation that made me glance up from my book. The lights overhead dimmed for a brief moment, and I heard a muffled sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the typical drone of the plane, but something else. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo from somewhere beneath us. I remember looking over at Sarah, expecting to see her roll her eyes, but she wasn't smiling. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. She glanced nervously out the window, and for a brief moment, I could swear I saw her lips tremble. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something was definitely wrong. The flight attendants were walking up and down the aisle, doing their routine checks, but there was something mechanical about their movements. Too stiff, too practiced. They didn't seem to notice the unease that had begun to settle over the plane. Then, it happened. A loud, cracking sound echoed through the cabin, followed by a sudden, violent jolt. The plane dropped sharply, and I felt my stomach lurch as everything around me seemed to lurch downward. The overhead compartments rattled, and several passengers gasped. The flight attendants immediately strapped themselves into their seats, their faces blank with terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, "please remain calm. We're experiencing some minor turbulence. We will be back on course shortly." But I knew it wasn't just turbulence. I don't know why I felt that, but I did. And then, as quickly as it had come, the turbulence stopped. The plane righted itself, and everything seemed normal again. But the unease lingered. My thoughts felt cloudy, as though I was trying to push through a fog. The sound of the engines outside seemed louder now, more oppressive. Sarah turned to me, her voice shaky. "I don't like this, Ethan. Something feels wrong." Before I could respond, there was another jolt. This time, the plane didn't level out. Instead, it dropped, plummeting for what felt like an eternity. Passengers screamed. I gripped the armrests, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't focus on anything. The world around me seemed to twist and contort, and I heard a strange, almost inaudible sound. Something like a whisper, But it didn't come from anyone around me. It was inside my head. The final thing I remember is the deafening roar of the engines as they sputtered, followed by a heavy, stomach-churning thud. When I woke, everything was silent. I don't know how long I had been unconscious, but the first thing that struck me was the cold. I opened my eyes to an endless expanse of white. Snow. Everywhere. The plane had crashed. There was no doubt in my mind. But why was I the only one awake? The cabin was empty, the seats all vacant. I could see the wreckage scattered around me, twisted metal, broken glass, but no one. No passengers, no flight attendants, nothing but snow. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, and I struggled to stand, my legs weak beneath me. It was then that I saw them. The bodies. Or what was left of them. They weren't human anymore. Their faces were wrong, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend, frozen in the snow like grotesque sculptures. I never got a good look at whatever it was, because I don't remember anything after that. I was rescued and spent a long time in the hospital. It wasn't until years later, when I started working with genetic cloning, that I realized something was terribly wrong. The vision, the crash, everything. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't just trauma from the accident. It was real, and I was about to learn just how real. It had been months since the crash. The wreckage of Flight 249 had been pulled from the remnants of the mountains, but my family, the core of my existence, was gone. I had buried them in a ceremony that barely felt real. It was all a dream. Something I couldn't wake up from. The house was too quiet. The world was too loud, like a sound that never stopped ringing in my ears. I don't know when it started. The idea, the obsession, crept into my mind slowly, like a seed taking root. At first, it was just a fleeting thought, something that no rational person would entertain. But the grief, the overwhelming, suffocating grief, made me think about possibilities. What if I could bring them back? In my professional life, I had always been a man of science, genetics, engineering. I had worked on some of the most advanced cloning techniques. Nothing public, of course, nothing that could draw attention. But I knew what I was doing. I knew how to manipulate genetic material, how to recreate life. What I didn't know was how far I was willing to go to overcome death itself. I gathered the necessary materials: hair, skin cells, blood samples, everything I needed to recreate them. The first step was to obtain their DNA. That had been easier than I expected. I had kept locks of their hair, some clothing items, even the smallest personal effects, tucked away for safekeeping. I wasn't sure what I intended to do with them, but I never imagined it would come to this. But it was all I had left. The technology I used to clone them was sophisticated. I had refined it over years of my career, working with the best equipment money could buy. There were no mistakes here. Or so I thought. To make the clones, I used a process known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, SCNP. In simple terms, I took somatic cells, the cells that are found in all the tissues of the body, except sperm and egg cells, and I extracted the nuclei. These nuclei contained all the genetic material, the blueprint for their bodies, their traits. I placed the nuclei into empty egg cells, ones that had their own genetic material removed. These fused cells were then given an electrical shock to initiate development. After the initial shock, the cells began to divide, just like in a normal pregnancy. The embryos were then cultured in an artificial environment where they were nurtured and monitored. Everything was methodical. Everything was precise. I had Sarah's, Ben's, and Lily's genetic material, but there was something that I didn't account for. Memories. How do you clone memories? The thought came to me one late night as I stared at the glowing monitors, surrounded by tubes and machinery. I knew that memory wasn't stored in the DNA itself, but I had heard rumors, whispers in academic circles, about memory transference. How neural patterns could be captured, how the mind could leave echoes of its experiences behind. The idea took hold. What if the memories of their final moments, the crash, the terror, the screams, were embedded somehow in their genetic makeup? What if I could replicate that? It was a foolish thought, and yet it felt right. I wasn't just trying to bring back their bodies. I wanted their essence, their souls. I wanted them to remember. I wanted them to feel alive again. The embryos grew faster than I expected. By the time they reached full term, the clones were indistinguishable from the originals. I could see their faces, their expressions, their movements. It was uncanny. They looked like Sarah, Ben, and Lily, but something was wrong. It started small at first. I woke one night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I dismissed it. After all, I had been working around the clock, and the stress had made my mind play tricks on me. But when I opened the door to check, I saw her, Sarah, the clone, standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the wall. Her eyes were wide open, but there was a strange, hollow look to them. It was like she wasn't really seeing me. "Sarah?" I called, my voice trembling despite myself. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her body rigid, her arms by her sides. The hallway light flickered once, twice, and then she slowly turned her head to look at me. "Ether," she whispered, but the tone was wrong. It was distorted, like she had spoken it in a dream. "I remember the fire," she said, her voice growing more distant. "I remember the flames, the smoke. I couldn't breathe." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my head spinning. I had been careful. I had erased any memories related to the crash before initiating the cloning process. How could she know what had happened? I rushed to the lab, my hands shaking as I checked the data. Everything seemed fine at first glance. No anomalies, no signs of memory interference. The clones were functioning within expected parameters. But then I reviewed the neural patterns. As I studied the clones' brain scans, something didn't add up. The neural activity was too active. It was as if there were flashes of something, trapped memories, lost and broken pieces, remnants of their final moments on the flight. My heart pounded as I sifted through the data, realizing that the memories had somehow become part of their consciousness, fused with their genetic replication. I had made a terrible mistake. The clones didn't just resemble Sarah, Ben, and Lily. They were haunted, fractured echoes of their final moments, distorted memories that shouldn't have been theirs, but had somehow bled into their very essence. Memories that belonged to the real versions of my family. The crash, the screams, the suffocating heat, the terror, and something else. I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. I remember the fire, the flames, the smoke. How could she possibly know that? My mind, the very thing I had trusted to control the situation, was betraying me. I had erased everything related to the crash before cloning them. Every trace of memory, gone. I had taken every precaution, or so I thought. It wasn't until I reviewed the data again that I realized something terrifying. I had missed something crucial, something beyond the grasp of science. I had been so focused on replicating their bodies, so sure that cloning them would recreate them in full, that I had failed to account for the existence of something intangible, something science couldn't measure: the soul. That elusive, ethereal essence of life. It had somehow found its way back. Their souls, Sarah's, Ben's, Lily's, had returned. They had come back, and with them, a deep, unrelenting thirst for vengeance. It started with the cat. The neighbor's cat, a mangy creature that had always irritated Sarah. It would wander around our yard, scratching at the door, meowing incessantly. The one animal Sarah could never tolerate. I never paid much attention to it, but Sarah, the clone, had always seemed bothered by it. It was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. One night, I came home late from the lab. my mind heavy with the weight of failure, what I had done, when I saw the cat lying motionless on the doorstep. At first, I thought it had simply been run over or met some other unfortunate end, but then I saw the blood. A gruesome, violent mess. The cat's body was mangled, its face twisted into an expression of terror. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned and looked into the house. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at the cat with a vacant expression. Her eyes, those eyes, held no remorse, no sorrow, just emptiness. "Sarah," I called, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't even blink. But I saw the faintest smile tug at the corner of her lips. "I hated that cat," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. But I heard it clearly, and it sent a chill crawling down my spine. I stepped inside, my thoughts racing. What had happened? Was she responsible for the cat's death? I needed to know, but before I could process the implications, I felt something shift. The air grew thick. Then I heard it. Ben's voice from the other room, calling my name in a low, guttural tone. It wasn't Ben. It couldn't have been. But it sounded like him, as if the sound came from deep within the house itself, echoing off the walls, reverberating in my bones. I rushed to the living room, where Ben stood, his cologne eerily still, staring at the ground. But as I drew closer, I saw that he wasn't alone. There, in the corner, was Lily, the clone of Lily. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face as pale as marble. And then, the moment froze. The three of them stood together, and I realized what had happened. They weren't just empty shells. They weren't merely physical manifestations of my family's DNA. They had returned with memories, their souls intact, and their souls were angry. I couldn't deny the truth any longer. I had brought them back, but I had failed to bring them back whole. The memories of their deaths, the terror, the anguish, had become their reality, and it was consuming them. I went into the lab one night, desperate to find a way to end it all, to undo the disaster I had created. As I ran diagnostic checks, I saw a spike in neural activity, an anomaly in the memory data. It was as if their souls were merging with the very machinery I had created. They were no longer just trapped in their bodies. They had invaded the system. They knew everything about their lives, everything about me. I hadn't put that data there, but it didn't matter. Their souls had found a way to connect, remember, and access what they once had. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't undo it. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table nursing a cup of cold coffee. The newspaper was spread out in front of me, the headline glaring up at me like a warning. Murder of Harry Thompson. Police suspect woman's involvement. I ran my fingers over the paper, the words blurring for a moment. Police suspect it was a woman. The sentence repeated in my head like a drumbeat, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. Then, something clicked. A rush of recognition. My pulse quickened. Harry Thompson. I knew that name. My mind scrambled to connect the dots. Sarah's ex-boyfriend from college. The one she'd always talked about in passing. The one she said she was done with, but who lingered in the background like a shadow. Their pagan werewolves only glared at him. I'd never paid attention to him back then. Hell, I'd barely even thought about him. But now everything started to make sense. It was all coming back to me. Sarah's words, the way she'd look over her shoulder when she thought no one was watching, the way she'd get quiet when Harry's name came up. There was always a darkness there, something unspoken. But I never asked. I was too wrapped up in my own mess, too distracted by my own choices. Next day, my phone rang. I recognized the number. It was Marcus, one of my old friends, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while but still kept in touch with. I didn't want to pick up. The last thing I needed right now was to hear any more bad news. But some primal instinct kicked in, and I answered it. "Marcus?" I said, my voice hoarse. "Ilan, man, where are you? You need to hear this." There was an urgency in his voice, a frantic edge I hadn't heard in years. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "It's April. She's gone. They found her body this morning." April, Sarah's best friend, the one who had always been by her side, the one who had laughed with us, shared secrets, and always seemed so innocent. But I knew the truth. April and I had crossed a line. We'd cheated behind Sarah's back. I had betrayed Sarah in the worst way possible. And now, April was dead. I didn't need to hear the details. The whispers, the rumors, they all pointed to one thing: revenge. I understood it now. Sarah hadn't known what April and I had done, but the clone did. The clone knew everything? The realization sent a chill down my spine. Sarah hadn't remembered, not the real Sarah, but the clone, the one who had taken her place, who carried her essence. That one knew. And now, the clone was hunting down anyone who had wronged her. It was all clear now. April's death wasn't a random act. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was revenge. Sarah, or whatever version of Sarah this was, had returned for justice. For me. My heart raced as panic surged through my veins. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I was next. I had cheated on Sarah, betrayed her trust, and now I would pay the price. I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. I stood up, trembling, the ring still clutched in my hand. It felt like the walls were closing in. Every breath was harder to take. April was dead, and I knew deep down my time was running out. Sarah's clone would come for me next, and I was powerless to stop it. As I stood there, my mind racing, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the nightmare I had unknowingly set in motion, I felt the cold ring still clenched in my hand, the same ring that had been the catalyst for everything that led to this moment. The death of April, the reappearance of the clones, and now the overwhelming fear that I was next. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move, as if the gravity of my mistakes had tied me to the spot. The silence of the room was deafening. Every clock tick felt like a countdown, a reminder that the inevitable was closing in. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with panic. Then I saw her. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. In the doorway, there was Sarah, or rather, the clone of Sarah. She was standing there, holding a knife, her face blank, yet cold in a way that made my skin crawl. I blinked, trying to process the scene, but my thoughts were jumbled. The fear was paralyzing. Sarah, the real Sarah, had been a memory, a lost memory. But here she was again, her clone standing before me, her eyes dark with an unsettling intensity. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. The knife gleamed in her hand, reflecting the dim light in a way that made my stomach turn. She took a step forward, her movements deliberate, slow, almost as if she was savoring the moment. I wanted to beg. I wanted to apologize and say anything that could make this nightmare disappear. But it was too late. My mind screamed in disbelief as the reality of it all crashed over me. I could hear the voice in my head, a question that kept repeating, repeatedly, like a broken record. Why? Why did I bring them back? I had been selfish. I had been blinded by grief, by my guilt. I never stopped to think about what might happen if I succeeded in bringing Sarah and the others back from the dead. I never thought about the consequences, about what they would become. But now, standing there with the cold knife in her hand, I realized this was never about closure. This wasn't about love or redemption. This was about revenge. As I stood, frozen, my heart racing, I could see it in her eyes. Something I had never noticed before. A cold, unforgiving rage. The person I once knew, the Sarah I had betrayed, was gone. What stood before me now was something darker, something vengeful. The clones, each of them, had returned, not to fix the past, but to make me pay for the choices I had made. Her expression was unreadable as she stepped closer, and for a split second I felt the overwhelming weight of what I had done. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have thought I could bring them back without repercussions? I never thought about its cost. I never thought about what the clones would do once they had their memories back, once they remembered how I had betrayed them, how I had used them. Now it was too late. The knife hovered inches from my skin. I could feel the cold steel, the sharp edge ready to end it all. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words stuck in my throat. As I stared into the cold, empty eyes of the clone, I knew this was the price I had to pay. This was the final reckoning. And as the knife moved closer, I finally understood the revenge I had unknowingly given them. And now, I was the one who would pay the price.